Shabbat blessing. Baruch atah Yahweh Eloheinu, melech haolam, asher noten lanu et Yeshua Moshe Enu, or ha'olam. Blessed are you, Yahweh our God, King of the universe, who gave to us Yeshua our Mashiach, the light of the world. A song for the Shabbat, Tehillim 92, 1 through 16. A song for the Shabbat. It is good to give thanks to Yahweh and to sing to your name, Most High, to make your mercies known in the morning and your faithfulness every night. Upon 10 strings and upon the harp, upon the resonating harp. For you, Yahweh, have made me rejoice in your deeds. I will overcome in the works of your hand. How great are your deeds, O Yahweh! Your thoughts are very deep. A brutish man does not know, nor does a fool understand this. The wicked sprout as the grass, and though all the deeds of the wicked flourish, the wicked deeds will be destroyed forever. And you, Yahweh, are from the heights forever. For behold your enemies, Yahweh, for behold your enemies will perish. All the deeds of the wicked shall be scattered. And you will raise up my strength as the rhino. I will be anointed with fresh oil. My eyes shall see my enemies. My ears shall hear wickedness rising against me. But righteousness shall flourish as a palm tree. As a cedar in Lebanon it grows. Those that are planted in the house of Yahweh shall flourish in the courts of our God. In old age they still bear fruit. They will be satisfied and prosperous as a declaration that Yahweh is upright, a rock with no injustice in him. Praise to Yahweh from Tehillim 97, 1 through 12. Yahweh reigns, the earth will rejoice, the multitudes of the coast will be glad. Clouds of thick darkness surrounds him. Righteousness and judgment establishes his throne. Fire goes before him and consumes his enemies round about. His lightning illuminates the world. The earth saw it and trembled. The mountains melt like wax in the presence of Yahweh, in the presence of the Lord of the entire earth. The heavens declare his righteousness, and all the people see his glory. All the servants of idols who boast in nothingness are confounded. Bow down to him, all you little gods. Zion heard and was glad, and the daughters of Yehudah rejoiced because of your judgments, Yahweh. For you, Yahweh, are high above all the earth, exalted far above all little gods. They love Yahweh that hate evil. He keeps the souls of his Hasidim. He snatches them from the hand of the wicked. Light is sown for the righteous, and gladness to the upright heart. The righteous rejoice in Yahweh and give thanks at the thought of his holiness. Praise to Yahweh from Tehillim 93, 1 through 5. Yahweh reigns, he is clothed in majesty. Yahweh is clothed with strength, he is prepared. The world is established and immovable. Your throne is established from eternity to eternity. The streams have lifted up, Yahweh. The streams have lifted up their voices. The streams lift up their waves. Yahweh is high and more mighty than the sounds of great waters, more mighty than breaking waves. Your testimony is exceedingly faithful. Holiness is fitting in your house forever and ever. Save me from my enemies, Tehillim 13, 1 through 6. To the chief musician, a psalm to David. How long will you forget me, Yahweh? Forever? How long will your face be hidden from me? How long will grief daily be the counsel of my soul? How long will my enemies rise up against me? Consider my afflictions, Yahweh, my God. Make my eyes to shine, lest I sleep with the dead. Lest my enemies say, I have prevailed over him, and my adversaries rejoice, for I am shaken. But in your mercy I trust. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing to Yahweh, for he has recompensed me. Forgive me, Tehillim 130, 1 through 8. A song of degrees. From the depths I have cried to you, Yahweh. Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to my plea for mercy. If you, Yah, keep records of iniquities, who could survive it? But with you there is forgiveness, so that you will be held in awe. I wait for Yahweh, my soul waits, and in his words I have hope. The Lord keeps my soul like a watchman from morning to morning. For with Yahweh there is mercy, and with him is great redemption, and he will ransom Yisrael from all their iniquities. Please turn to the east for the reciting of the Shema. Be'ivrit, Shema Yisrael, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad. Ve'ahavta et Yahweh Elohecha b'kol levavcha uv'chol nafshecha uv'chol me'odecha. Ve'hayu hadevarim ha'eleh asher anohi metzavcha hayom al levabacha. And in English, hear Yisrael, Yahweh our God, Yahweh is the only one. And you will love Yahweh your God in all your heart, and in all your soul, and in all your strength. And the words that I command you this day will be in your heart. Turning back, let us shed some love on our neighbors. Be'ivrit, lotikom velotitor et b'nei amecha ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha ani Yahweh. And in English, you shall not avenge or hold a grudge against the children of your people, and you will love your close friend as yourself. I am Yahweh.
Is it live or is it Memorex? All right. Looks like today would be a good day to pick up with Vayikra, chapter 4, verse 16. Also known as Leviticus, chapter 4, verse 16, to the uninitiated. Today we're going to learn some things that maybe you didn't know were in the, as the Christians call it, Old Testament. Literally, verse 16, if we just translate real literal into English, it says, and make come, which of course is to bring, the priest, the Messiah, from blood the young bull to tent appointed times. So, it's going to be different today, isn't it? We start off with the heavy and make come. So you're going to bring, you're going to grab by the hand and lead it, or you're going to take like a bull and put a rope around its head. You're going to pull the rope, or maybe a sheep or a lamb, So it's to make someone come. It's to bring them. It's not exactly voluntarily. Doesn't mean that they'll resist, but you're not giving an option here. Then it says HaKohen. So the Kohen's going to bring something, right? But it says HaKohen HaMashiach. HaKohen HaMashiach. The priest, the Messiah. The priest, the Messiah. The priest is not bringing the Messiah. The priest is HaMashiach. The priest is the Messiah. The Messiah, of course, is the anointed one. What happens to the priest when he's brought? Kings are anointed when they become kings. Not so uncommon, right? So in this case, the priest is the Messiah, the consecrated one, the holy one, the one that's set aside. And this is Midam. So the Messiah, priest, is going to bring the blood. The blood. Dam, like Adam. Did y'all know that was from blood? Which is, I remember reading this in a English translation. Actually, I think it's the Jacinius that talks about how the word Adam means red and ruddy, and somehow that equals white people. No, Dam is blood, and it's called that because the color should be, you should be making that red, not white, right? Because it's not about the color, it's about the blood itself. It's about life and that sort of thing. Then it says hapar. So you're going to bring the blood. And remember that last word, it had the m sound, the midam. So it's from blood, literally. So then it says hapar. So you're going to bring the blood from the young bull. Well, not you, but the Messiah is going to bring the blood from the young bull. The Messiah is the priest Messiah. This is El, which is properly a noun indicative of motion, direction to any place. So it's from here to there. Good example, right? To Ohel, not to hell where Christians think everybody goes, but Ohel, the tent, the tabernacle, the assembly, the congregation. Of course, this is Moed. So now we know it's the tent of meetings, the tent of appointed times. All right, so our translation in 4:16, and the Cohen will bring from the blood of the young bull and bring it to the tent of appointed times. We can compare that to chapter 4, verse 5. Just, a few verses back that said, and the Cohen, the Messiah, will take from the blood of the young bull and bring it to the tent of appointed times, right? So now the Kyle and Deluge commentary to the Hebrew Bible says the following. The presentation, laying on of hands, and slaughtering were the same as in the case of the other sacrifices. In other words, this sacrifice is done the same way the sacrifice of a lamb is done. Remember, because we're on the young bull at this point. The first peculiarity occurs in connection with the blood, verses 5 through 7. The anointed priest was to take a part of the blood and carry it into the tabernacle. And having dipped in the language that word would be, I think it's misspelled, but in the Holy of Holies, from Exodus 26:31 is their comparison here. In other words, in curtain. That don't make any sense. Now he was to put some of the blood, it says, on the corners, are actually the corners, unless of course it's actual horns on an animal. And then again, it's not always that they're talking about the horns. If they're talking about the actual horns on the head, they just may be talking about the strength. The horns are the strongest part of the ox. So that, remember, primitive language, few words. Anyway, so they said they're supposed to put some on the horns of the altar of incense and then pour out the great mass of the blood, of which only a small portion had been used for sprinkling, and smear it on the corners of the altar and at the bottom of the altar of burnt offerings. A sevenfold sprinkling in the face of the veil, rather, also took place in connection with the sin offering for the whole congregation, as well as with the ox and the he-goat, which the high priest offered as sin offerings on the Day of Atonement for himself, the priesthood. The blood was sprinkled 7 times before, lipnei, the Hebrew word, the chaporet, which is the lid, and that's from chapter 16, verse 14, and 7 times on the corners or horns of the altar. So again, that's coming from chapter 16, verses 18 and 19. So too, the blood of the red cow was slaughtered as a sin offering outside the camp, was sprinkled 7 times in the direction toward the tabernacle. And they're, of course, pointing out Numbers 19:4. The sevenfold sprinkling at the Feast of Atonement had respect to the purification of the sanctuary from the blemishes caused by the sin of the people, with which they had been defiled in the course of the year. It's from chapter 16. And did not take place till after the blood had been sprinkled once again on the chaporet, on the lid, the mercy seat, for the expiation of the sin of the priesthood, the people in the corners of the altar had been smeared with blood. Again, chapter 16, were specifically 14 and 18. Whereas in the sin offerings mentioned in this chapter, the sevenfold sprinkling preceded the application of the blood to the corners of the altar. This difference in the order of succession of the two manipulations with the blood leads to the conclusion that in the case before us, the sevenfold sprinkling had a different signification from that which it had on the Day of Atonement, and served, I spelled it wrong, it took me a while to figure out what that word was, served as a preliminary and introduction to the expiation, the forgiveness of sin. Sorry, I couldn't think of what expiation was. The blood also was not sprinkled upon the altar of the holy place, but only before Yahweh, against the curtain behind which Yahweh was enthroned. That is to say, only into the neighborhood of the gracious presence of God. It's a funny way to say that. And this act was repeated 7 times, that in the number 7, as the stamp of the covenant relation which sin had loosened might be restored. Well, it's a long way to go to tell you that this was for the remission of sin. Anyway, golly, there's a lot more stuff there. I'm just going to skip it. It's not, you can't hardly understand these people anyway. Moving on, literally it says, and dip the priest's finger, from the blood and make spatter 7 times to faces Yahweh, faces the curtain. All right, so ve taval and dip, it's to immerse, so, but in this case, if you're only putting a finger in, we tend to say dip, right? Because you're just dipping your finger. But you are immersing it, right? So it is the word for immerse, and it is the root word of John the Baptist in Hebrew. For those of you who care, this is hakon. So the priest is going to the priest, the Messiah priest, is going to dip his finger. Of course, it doesn't say Messiah here, but we're talking about the same guy, not a different one. So the Messiah priest is going to dip etzba'o, his finger. Min, which is the word from, ha-dam, from the blood, vehizah, and zip, he's going to make it splatter, right? Then it's Sheva, which is Elisheva. What are other words we say that have the number 7 in them? Some say Shabbat comes from that. I don't buy it, because Shabbat is rest, and since the rest is on the 7th day, blah, blah, blah. I still don't buy it, though. I don't think it's connected properly for that. Although there are real smart people that would call me an idiot for saying that. Who was the one that came to hear the wisdom of Solomon? Bathsheba, right? I was just trying to think of a couple things there. That's 7. The number, the ordinal numbers, to be technical. Then it says pe'amim, blood, lipnei, to the faces, sling this blood right in the face of Yahweh, right? Now you have to know that this is used idiomatically. It's in the presence of, before. You can't, stand before somebody and not be in their presence. You know what I'm saying? So this is the idea. So in the presence of, and this is et pene. So that's the same word, faces. So you're before God and you're before hapa rochet. I think I've been calling that the lid. Anyway, sorry about that. It's the curtain. So the translation is, and the Cohen, the Messiah Cohen, will dip his finger and make spatter from the blood 7 times in the presence of, before the veil. God's name is missing from this. In the presence of Yahweh, because it uses God's name, and then it says before the veil. So we can compare that to chapter 4, verse 6. Wait a minute, I thought that's where we were. No, we're on 17. Okay, so we've already said this. And the Cohen will dip his finger in the blood and make spatter from the blood 7 times in the presence of... Is God's name not in this? I thought it was.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. I went back and looked. So I've left God's name out twice. I do not know how that happened. Oh, man. Just in case there's lightning. I'm sorry. I don't mean to matter that. I did not do that on purpose. God's name should have been in both of these verses. Anywho, so it says, and the Cohen, by the way, the Messiah Cohen, the Messiah priest, will dip his finger, it said in verse 6, in the blood. It does not say that here. And make spatter from the blood 7 times in the presence of Yahweh, should have been next. And then it says the veil. We would have to put and the veil for us to understand that. That's not necessary in Hebrew. Of the sanctuary, because it says of the holy, so they're talking about the sanctuary. Because remember, holy is back there, and holy is here, and anyway, so we would call that sanctuary. Now listen, Onkelos's Vayikra by Drazin and Wagner says the following. Each sprinkling required a dipping for a total of 7 dippings. Of course, they're quoting the Sifra. Whether that's true or not, we don't know because it doesn't say. But it makes sense because to stick your finger in the blood one time and get 7 sprinkles out of it, probably not. Anyway, so the commentators note that the number 7 occurs frequently in Judaism, 7 days of the week, 7 weeks counted on Shavuot. The 7th month is Rosh Hashanah. I don't know why that was important. 7 years in a sabbatical year, 7 sabbatical years in a jubilee. The holiday of Passover and Sukkot are 7 days. There were 7 branches of the candelabrum. Balaam built 7 altars in Numbers 20 through 23, etc. It says. It can also be said that the holidays of Sukkot and Hag HaMatzot, the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, occur on the night of the 14th day of the month, which is twice 7. And the Passover offering was brought on the 14th day of the month. Double 7, right? Whatever, man. Just whatever. I'm sorry, but just whatever. Let's move on. Do I have time? Yeah, I have time. Plenty of time. All right. So, verse 18. And from the blood he give upon horns, or he place upon horns. To give is to place. It's blood he pour to foundation, altar, the burnt offering, that entrance, tent appointed times. So we're going to reach a familiar argument in this one. We start off with umim, which is and from hadam, so and from the blood, ye 10, that's to give, to put, to place, to cause, to receive. It's that word. It's where we get the name Nathan or Natan, if you're in Israel. This says to place it al, which means upon, karnot, on the corners. Now, yes, that's horns in plural, but we are speaking of the corners here, not the actual. Wait a minute. If it doesn't say, let me see this. The corner. Yeah, it is corner. Because it's the word for horns, and it's the horns of an ox or a goat, as I said a while ago. So you got to be careful. You can't just jump in there and do what I just did and just assume it means corners. You got to know that the next thing it says is an ox, then it really is the horns of an ox. If the next thing it says is mitzbaot, or mitzbaach rather, or mitzbeach in this case, that's the corners of the ark. That's not the the ark did not have horns poking out of the corners. I'm sorry, they just didn't. But Rob, I've seen it in a picture. Yes, there are pictures. They're not real. Can you? What's that software? Yeah, can you say Photoshop? Or some artist painting from the Dark Ages? Anyway, yeah, that there are no pictures of any horned altar from that far back. All right, so anyway, it's the altar. Then it says Asher Lipnei, that because Lipnei is to the face, right? So it means before. Then it uses the proper name of God. It says Yahweh. And just in case there's somebody out there who's never heard me say this, yes, I say the name of God, and yes, this is as close as we will probably ever get to knowing how to say the name of God. There is nobody on this planet that knows it for sure, because it has never been recorded by sound or video. The phonetical sound, even if it had been written out, which it was not, but even if it had been written out from the time of Moshe, we still wouldn't know it, because the pronunciation of the actual letters and stuff, we don't know that a tate had a t sound. We don't. We know it does now, but we don't know what it did then. So the likelihood that I'm saying it exactly right, slim to none. So I'm not worried about, what if it's so holy you can't say God's name? See, that bothers me. That bothers me to the nth degree. Because the truth is, there are those who have tried desperately to push this idea that God's name is so holy you can't pronounce it as far back as they can possibly push it. And they can't get it any further than the first century. And it didn't belong there. It wasn't there. It's that the translations we have from the 4th century are of things from the 1st century. Translations. They're not the original documents. They are translations. And the translations don't use the name of God. So they say that proves that in the 1st century they didn't use it. No, that does not prove any such thing. It proves that by the 4th century they weren't doing it. They weren't using the name of God. And they forced that into the 1st century by not translating it the way they should have. So all the way into at least the 2nd century CE, and every moment of time before then, foreign kings and foreign slaves pronounced verbally, out loud, audibly, I can't say it, audibly. Wow. I think my tongue is drunk. Too much coffee. I got to cut down on the coffee. All right. Foreign slaves. There is a story in the 1st century of a foreign eunuch that knew the name of God. Come on, people. They said the name of God. They did. They had no problem with it until Hellenization took over and people who didn't speak the Hebrew language started making the rules. People who wrote everything they wrote in Aramaic because they had no clue what a Hebrew word looked like, sound like, or meant. They're the ones that came up with that nonsense. not the people who knew the Bible from history, that spoke the language, that understood the idioms. The onkelos has no clue what an idiom is. No clue. I don't care what Drauzina Wagner says. It does not. Because just this week I worked on something that I was doing comparative on the onkelos. And I'm not saying onkelos is bad. I use it every week. Hello. But there are some problems here. He took an idiom and replaced it with another idiom. And first off, he didn't know the original thing was an idiom. And second off, he didn't know the second thing he put in there was an idiom. Because he used the second thing literally. The guy did not recognize idioms. Drauzina Wagner, one of them wrote that he did. He did not. Not even a little bit. There was like 2 idioms that the guy knew. And those are, he kind of knew them, but not really. Anyway. But when Hellenization took over, everything went literal. Absolutely literal. And Judaism of old went away. It didn't come back until the Dark Ages, and all of that stuff was uttered, made up by men who didn't speak the language, didn't know a thing about biblical customs and culture. What they did was take stuff mostly from the Christians and try to make it Jewish. Come on, people. We can say God's name. We should say God's name. How long would your wife stay with you? Say spouse, so we can go either way here. How long would your spouse stay with you if you refused to say your spouse's name and instead called your spouse the name? Hey, the name, would you mind giving me a cup of coffee? Hey, the name, would you mind mowing that yard? How long would your spouse put up with that? That's not exactly what I would call a pet name. The name. That's not, hey, sugar, hey, babe, hey, hun. It's none of those things. And it's an absolute refusal to call somebody you claim to have an intimate relationship with by their name. And then you can read in the Talmud all these arguments that they have about, well, you can't do this because, let me see if I can make this into an example real quick off the top of my head. God's name is so holy that you can't say it. Well, if God's name is so holy that you can't say it, his name is so holy you can't think about it. And if that's true, then God's hands are so holy you can't be touched by him. Oh, well, that's all right because he doesn't have any hands. He's Casper the freaking ghost. Think about what you're saying, what you believe here. If God has no hands, because that's what Onkelos said, he had no hands, he had no nose, he had no lips, he had no ears, yet we were somehow created in his image? Yikes. But if his name is too holy, then aren't the words that came out of his mouth too holy? Oh, you better not be reading out loud anything that God wrote. In fact, you better not be looking at anything God wrote. You shouldn't be thinking about anything God wrote. Boy, if I had time to mess with that, I could make that go on and on and on and on until you were not allowed to do anything that had anything to do with religion. Because it's dumb. Anyway, so it said, I've lost my mouse here. Hang on. There we go. It said Asher Be'ohel. So that is in the tent. What were we doing here before that? He was going to do something to the altar. I don't remember what. What?
Open on the horns.
Are we putting blood on the horns or something? I can't even believe I have to go this far to find it. He's going to place the blood on the corners of the altar. And then it was in the presence of Yahweh God. And that's in the tent, the altar that's in the tent. of moed, of appointed times. And it says, ve'et kol, all hadam, all the blood, yishpoch, he will pour out. It's like taking a picture, and not a picture, but a picture. How many people call pictures pictures? The same. A picture is something you take with a camera. A picture is something that pours out. Let's keep those straight, people. It's a pet peeve of someone I know and love. Then we have the word El, which is to, yes, so, to the foundation, to the base of something. It, not necessarily the foundation, but like if you have a box and it's sitting on the floor, the base of that floor that it's sitting on is the base of that box. So it says you sow and then it says mizbach, the altar. So at the foot of the altar, right there where it sits. Ha'olah of burnt offerings. So it's the altar of burnt offerings. It says asher, that petach, that are at the entrance, at the opening. Ohel moed, at the opening of the tent of meetings. All right, so we have, and from the blood, he, speaking of the Mashiach Cohen, will place it, the blood, in the, or on rather, the corners, the horns of the altar of spiced incense in the presence of Yahweh, who is in the tent of appointed times, and he will pour all the blood of the young bull on the foundations of the altar of burnt offerings. It's a different altar. At the entrance of the tent of appointed times. This is where you do by the barbecue pit is where the vast majority of that blood will be poured. And we can compare that to verse 7. If it sounds familiar, it should. Now they've added, and from the blood, and they've added the word for corners in verse 18. That's not in this one. But there's a couple in this one that's not in that one, right? And the Cohen, the high priest, that's not what I meant to say, the Mashiach Cohen, the Messiah priest, will place the blood, they've added the word the blood, on the altar of, and here it actually says spiced incense in verse 7. It didn't say that before, or in this one. And this is in the presence of Yahweh, who is in the tent of appointed times, and he will pour all the blood of the young bull on the foundations of the altar of burnt offerings at the entrance of the tent of appointed times. Of the words corner or horns, Sa'adia recognized the Hebrew idiom and translated it corners. That, they caught that. Not everybody did. Most people did not. But Sa'adia's work did. And then where it says, pour all the blood, Sifra, Sa'adia, and Rashi correctly pointed out that it was the remaining blood that was to be poured on the ground. Right, because there's, you dip and you sprinkle, and people who take everything massively literal say, well, that's not possible because I sprinkled some. So we have to add the word remaining for the nerds. Can I call people nerds? All right. In verse 19, here goes the voice again. It's a kind of a short one. It says, and then it had a pointer, all fat he rise from us and make smoke and make burn you. So here you're going to actually cook the barbecue. You're actually going to barbecue the meat. I guess that's how you'd say that. Ve'et, so it's and then there's a pointer to something. Kol, which means all, its totality. Chelbo, so it's, and all the fat, all of its fat, the fat of this animal that is being now cooked on this grill, will be thrown, it says Yarim, so it'll be lifted up. So while he's cooking the meat, somebody's going to stand there beside it and hold the fat in the air, right? No, it's going to be cooked, and the smoke of it and the scent of it and all that is going to rise up. It's think of it as smoke rising up from it. It says mimanu, so from It'll be rising up from it. Vehiketir or vehiktir. It doesn't make any difference. I know that people who speak modern Hebrew are freaking out every time I do that, but this is how it would have been spoken back then. They wouldn't have slurred like this. They couldn't have slurred like this back then because nobody would understand what they were saying if they'd done it. Oh, but we do. I know we do today. This is a primitive language. Things were different. You had to speak them this way so that your listener got it right. All right, so it's to give a scent, to be fragrant, to offer odors, to burn incense in honor of a deity. In other words, it's this. What's going to rise up? Now it's telling you it's the smoke from the fat. No doubt some of it would come from the meat as well. This is ha-mizbeha, not mizbeach, mizbeha. And burn you. So now you got to just burn it with the fires of hellfire and damnation. That's from Back to the Future 3, I think. I've always loved the way that guy said that. No, that's not what it means. They're not telling you to burn your food. They're telling you to cook your food. Remember, primitive languages, few words, lots of meaning. So they use this to burn to burn a incense. Golly, I couldn't get that word out. To just regular cook food, to bring warmth in a cold day. It just well, literally it means to burn. Anyway, so the translation, and all the fat of it, speaking of the young bull, it rises. It does say it twice. All the fat of it, speaking of the bull, it, speaking of the sin, rises from us. It's not that our sin is rising to God. God's already very well aware of it. It's already reached his door. But that's the image that they want you to connect that with. It's as if our sins are being lifted from us, type of a thing. Or at least that's one way most of these people taught it. Rises from us, and you will make it, speaking of the fat, smoke, and make it, speaking of the fat again, burn. So in verse 8, it said, and all the fat of the young bull for the sin will separate from the hidden fat all the fat that is on the torso. So going to have to go back a little bit to try to remember that, because remember that was that excess fat and all that kind of stuff they called the hidden fat, and they use the word middle, speaking of the torso. All right, in chapter 3, verse 3, it said, and bring from the sacrifice the peace offering to Yahweh, the hidden fat, the torso, and all the fat on the torso. So, all right. Now, here's something from chapter 3, because we're talking essentially the same thing here. Nachmanides drew the distinction between the fat called by the rabbis shuman and the term cheleb employed here. The former cannot be disassociated from the meat. The latter can. So there was the fat that was on the meat, is what he's saying, and then there was just fat in there. And that is true. All right. So now Onkelos Vaikra by Drazina Wagner says, this is, and I quote, Onkelos translates the noun as tarbe. Haskuni insists that the Hebrew and Aramaic denote increase, which signifies something that is good and laudatory. The part of the body that makes the animal special, the good stuff, if you will. The chele, as they put it, is the fat that surrounds the kidney, liver, and entrails. It is forbidden for human consumption, ordinary fat that sticks to the animal's flesh is called shuman in rabbinic Hebrew and may be eaten. Said essentially the exact same thing that I just said, right? The Kyle and Deluge wrote, first, the fat which covered the entrails in chapter 1:9, in other words, the large net which stretches from the stomach over the bowels and completely envelops, the latter. Starts saying envelope. Secondly, all the fat on the entrails, in other words, the fat attached to the intestines, which would easily be peeled off. Thirdly, the 2 kidneys. Fourthly, the liver, blah, 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 blah. The 4 portions mentioned comprehended all the separable fat in the inside of the sacrificial animal. Hence, they were all designated. I was like, that's not disintegrated. Designated all the fat of the sacrifice. And of course, they're pointing out that it's in chapter 16, it's in chapter 4, verse 8, verse 19, verse 26, verse 31, and verse 35, as well as chapter 7, verse 3. I mean, they're right. All of these guys are in agreement, is what I'm trying to tell you. There's no argument here. Okay, so verse 20. Let's take us aside. I won't charge any extra for this. They're all in agreement. Now, they may or may not have sounded like they were, depending on how poorly I said all those things. I feel like I kind of messed those up. But I've said to people before, all of you guys listening today, I've talked about how in the New Testament, one of the biggest mistakes they made, and one of the major reasons why Jews don't get that that these are Jewish documents, is because when the translators got a hold of it, they weren't Jewish. They knew nothing about Hebrew customs, culture, history, literally knew nothing about the law. So they go in there and they translate things according to their understanding. Well, they noticed that there's 3 places, 3 different Talmud, 3 different disciples who tell the same story, and none of them line up. One of them's like, well, there was 2 guys in the cemetery, and the other 2 tell it, well, there was only 1 guy in the cemetery. So, first off, they didn't recognize that this was a parable and was not supposed to be taken literally. And I say that people get mad at Christians in particular get mad about that because they're like, oh no, if Jesus said it, then by gosh, it happened. Wait a minute. The story says that this man could take solid steel chains and rip them off his hands and throw them on the ground and stomp them into nothing. Go back and look. I'm not making that up. Just stomp on them. I'm sorry, but I don't care how crazy a man is, how big he is, how strong he is. He can't do that. It can't be done. That should tell you right there and then, this is not real. So they're telling a parable here. And why are they telling it different? They're all telling this parable that Yeshua taught them. Well, that's what they're supposed to do. You learn your parable from your rabbi, and then you make it yours. The 2 of them said that there was 1 guy living among the ruins of Israel. Or living among the ruins, I think it just said, of the graveyard. Hello, that's what the Jews of the 1st century called Israel. It was the ruins, and it was a graveyard, blah, blah, blah. Because most of it had been destroyed at this point. The temple still stood, and most of what the graveyard part was more about Judaism had been overtaken by the Romans. I mean, they sort of could live by their law, but actually they had to have permission for all the major things that they did in their law. And anyway, what these guys did was they made it their own. 2 of them would say that it was it was 1 guy. Well, they're calling all of Israel the 1 guy because they're talking about the state of things in Israel at their time. The other guy says that there's 2 because he's talking about Israel, and Judah. A very common thing in the time, right? So they made it their own. They may tell that same story 3 different ways because they're making 3 different points to 3 different groups of people. So to go in there like the translators did and try to pull stuff from each of the different ones to make them all more the same is a huge mistake. Well, the Talmud, the Megillah, the Haggadah, the Halacha, is all of Jewish material is like that. It says, or was like that, I should say, even through the 400s where most of this stuff originated. Like the Mishnah, let's talk about that in particular. Comes from the 400s. Mike could push it into the 300s, I suppose, but that's still more wishful thinking than truth. Anyway, Ben Zakkai writes this thing, or at least that's who they say did. They said Onkelos wrote the Onkelos, and he didn't. He lived 100 years, was dead 100 years before the Onkelos was written, but whatever. So let's say Yochanan ben Zakkai actually did this, and whenever he lived, he did this, right? In his work, he'll talk about, well, this rabbi said that when a woman left her house, she had to veil her face. And the other rabbi said when she left her house, it was a shame if she veiled her face. And people who read that in the Dark Ages, Maimonides, Rashi, Nachmanides, who's some other ones? Even Ezra, and on and on it goes, right? All these guys that are famous from the Talmud. By the time they come along, they don't know that. They've learned most of what they know about religion from the Christians. And yes, that is exactly where they got their knowledge. They sure didn't get it from Jews. And I know I'm going to, at some point, get some real pushback on that, but I'm telling the truth. These men didn't even speak Hebrew. They had to make all the stuff up that they did because they didn't know what they were talking about. They didn't know what they were looking at. And they had to just basically make it up, especially Maimonides. So they don't know that there's not a mistake, but they set out to prove that there is no mistake. So-and-so says she has to be veiled. So-and-so says she can't be veiled. There's no mistake here. There's no, that's not the word. What's the word I'm looking for, Donna? It's not mistake. Conflict. It's the thing that the people who hate God and say they don't believe in him say about Christianity all the time. There's too many contradictions. That's the word I'm looking for. There's no contradiction here. No, there wasn't, because this rabbi who said she had to be veiled, their synagogue lived by that because that was his interpretation of the law and the way it was applied to everyday life. The other rabbi who said that she shouldn't do it, their congregation had to live by his rules because that was his interpretation. And back in the day, when we were real Jews living according to real Torah, even oral Torah, it was okay. Back way back, when we still knew what Judaism really was and what it was supposed to be, and that it was us imitating the lifestyle of God, when we knew those things, we knew that that was okay. It was not a contradiction. It was the difference between 2 different men. One guy probably had the book of Deuteronomy, and maybe he had a book of Ezra. The next guy, maybe he had the book of Numbers or Leviticus, maybe, and, to put it in layman terms, and maybe he had a couple of the book of Psalms, because these would have been scrolls, people. They weren't books. They didn't have the whole Bible the way we have it today. They can't go and buy that art scroll Tanakh that I have. You didn't exist. So back in the day, it was at least a year's salary to get one book of the law. You did not have all 5. Actually, the law is only in 4 of them. I think differently. The first book is not the book of the law. It's the book of the history where we all came from and how it all started and how it all came together. You don't get into the law until chapter 12 of Exodus, and then you stay there almost exclusively until you get to the end of Deuteronomy. But anyway, they were supposed to differ. They weren't supposed to be the same. As time went on, and the books actually became a book where you could look at all of it, then maybe there'll be more agreement. But there are just pages and pages and pages of arguments. These guys going back and forth, condemning each other to hell and all of this stuff because they're trying desperately not to be wrong. Because we don't know what being Jewish is anymore at this point. Because being Jewish, it's more important to be right than it is to not be wrong. Can I say it that way? We used to have the 10 doctors of the law in a synagogue, because if I got up here and I said something backwards or I couldn't think of a word or whatever, there were 10 men there that could help me out, right? That was the whole point. But after a while, it became a matter of arrogance. If Rashi decided that you had to wear, and I'm making this up, but just for the sake of making the point, if Rashi decided you had to wear your face covered in public, then it wouldn't make any difference what my mom said. If he said opposite, now these two would be going at each other. And again, I'm making this up just to illustrate what happened all throughout the Talmud. Then instead of one or the other saying, well, why would you believe that? What did you base that on? Let's come together and figure this thing out. Instead of that, it was, well, you're going to hell because you didn't do this, or well, you're going to hell because you didn't do that. You know what I mean? It just became this ugly fight. And both were wrong because neither one of them knew there was an idiom. It's almost always over the idioms, almost always. In fact, I don't know of a time, can't think of one off the top of my head that didn't, the arguments like that did not involve an idiom that neither side knew that it was an idiom. That's a shame beyond belief in my book. But the point that I'm trying to make here is there are supposed to be differences. The way that we would live our lives according to the Torah in Texas may differ from the way you live your life in New York according to the Torah. Distance makes a difference. For instance, if you were in Jerusalem, maybe you live one way because you got the temple there and you go make your sacrifices. Maybe you live in New York. Probably not everybody's going to get on a plane 3 times a year and go to Israel, right? So the way it's applied for people who can't go to Israel is going to be different. And that's supposed to be okay. We can't all do it exactly the same way. Some people can't drink real wine. So somebody like me comes in and says, well, all grape juice, it's called grape juice, right? All grape juice is wine that's been defermented. So very literally, not just technically, but literally, grape juice is wine. It just is wine without the fermentation. Well, the law doesn't say that it has to be fermented, and it doesn't condemn the defermentation of it. None of that's there. So I might judge that you can drink the grape juice, which of course I do. I prefer the grape juice. I'm not a big fan of alcohol. I don't like the taste. I don't like what it does to my head. I'm not a fan at all. But I'm not going to tell you can't do it either, because you are commanded to drink wine. So whether it's alcohol free or not, that I have judged that our synagogue is okay with that. There are others who would say no. They're purists, if you will. It says wine. It doesn't make any room for, well, in case one day they come up with, some way to deferment it. And that's okay. If that's the way that guy's going to do that, if that's the way that rabbi judges it, it's perfectly fine according to the God we serve. It's not that rigid. So they were supposed to be different. It was supposed to be okay that one said they had to cover and one said they didn't. That was not a contradiction. So we need to know these things before we start trying to argue our side against somebody else, because we may both be wrong and we may both be right. Anyway, I've run out of time. I really have. So I'm going to have to call it a day and say shalom, shalom, y'all.
The blessing, Be'ivrit. Yevarecha Yahweh v'yish merecha. Ya'er Yahweh panai v'lecha v'hunecha. Yisa Yahweh panai v'lecha v'yasim lecha shalom. And in English, may Yahweh cause you to lie down so that you may rest. May he touch and caress you. May he prepare you for what is ahead. May he watch over you. May he keep you from harm. May he cause goodness to grow in you and take away the bad. May he arrange your life and cause you to flourish. May he cheer you up and gladden your heart. May he cause his light to shine through you. May he show you tenderness, favor, and love in his presence. May he show you kindness and be delicate towards you. May he show you his generosity, mercy, compassion, and desire for you as it comes forth from the depths of his soul. May he lift you out of your pit and deliver you from the things that hold you prisoner. May he draw you to his chest and cast his eyes on yours. May he show you his love and desire for you as he cradles you in his arms. May he bear your punishment and pardon you of your sin. May he take you for his bride. May he establish a foundation in you. May he place his name on your heart and mind and make your body his temple. May you be his treasure. May you always be on his mind. May he draw you near and comfort you when you are afraid. May he assure you there is nothing to fear because he is with you. May you and all that concerns you be at peace because he is your friend. Amen.
Whew, it got toasty in here.